Hi, I'm Ryan Cannon, and I'm here to talk about there is no off-season, NFL.com's move to YUI. And before I start, note in case you intend to present at YUI next year, send Dave Glass your photo. Otherwise, he'll end up sending you something with, or finding a photo of you with unshaven on the backpacking trail for 3 days. That was great. So I also have another name for this talk, and it's how the NFL's front engineers got serious about performance, learned to write JavaScript applications, and grew a little in the process. I do want to tell you a little bit myself. I am an application developer, which means I don't write just JavaScript. Some of the things that I do are things like Flash video players. I also write our iOS wrapper for our fantasy application. But most of my time is spent in JavaScript. I work for the NFL, and this is what we do. And if you're not familiar with the NFL, we're a professional sports league. Our season lasts about half the year, and there's some of the most watched programs on network television. And NFL.com, the part of the business that I work for, specializes in several things about the NFL. It's a hub for media and news about the teams, stats. We host a ton of live events, and we're the hub for the NFL community to talk about the teams and tweet and share anything they want about the National Football League. So the NFL.com, or the NFL season is built into a cycle, which I kind of depicted here. It starts when the Super Bowl ends, and is punctuated by a series of events throughout the year. And the main thing to take away from this graph is that we have a very fast schedule of features there. Every single one of these events usually includes a big sprint process. And I designed this calendar to look like this because it reminds me a lot of this one, which is the Mayan calendar, because like the NFL calendar, it's set in stone. And a lot of our features simply have to go out. And so, because the Super Bowl is going to happen whether we're ready for it or not. So in 2007, NFL brought all of its web development for NFL.com in-house. And we had a small team of 3 engineers and a manager. And we built some really cool things. We used Prototype for our framework at the time. This is the NFL.com Live application that showed live stats about an NFL game that was going on, as well as allowed users to interact with the network talent that was talking on the broadcast. We built a game center that allowed users to track the status of the game and use 3D drawing in Flash, and allowed users to watch videos and discuss the game as well as see the stats update online. And for the draft, we built these draft war rooms, which allowed fans to come in, rate how they thought their team was doing about the draft, and comment as well about how they felt things were going on. And this saw like huge uptake. It was really popular. But there was a problem with all these things, and they took a really long time to build. Our code organization wasn't really very consistent. We had a bunch of engineers that would do their own work in silos, and a lot of times the code didn't share very much. We had to rewrite some things because of subtle differences in our requirements. And CSS was a nightmare to manage. It was really hard for us to keep everything straight amongst all the different pages we had. Prototype does provide some features for object-oriented class design. This is an example, but all it really gives you is a constructor, and the rest is sort of up to you as to how you organize your code. And so after we realized that we weren't just building, we were writing scripts, we weren't building applications. And that was something that was a problem for us. We needed to have more complicated things that were easier for us to update. Fast forward to 2010, and the NFL has grown significantly. In addition to our team working on NFL.com, we released a fantasy application written by another team that was using YUI. And our club sites project was a third team that was using jQuery move all of the NFL.com team sites onto a single platform. And so having 3 different teams working on 3 different frameworks was really hard for us to share code and work together. And so NFL.com decided to move away from Prototype and try and join the other teams. So why not jQuery? This seems kind of like an obvious question. Microsoft and Adobe have recently picked up jQuery, and it's gained a lot of traction as a framework. However, we felt that it was still just a browser abstraction framework. And while they have a very vibrant community and a lot of plugins that can help you get most of the way there, it seemed like it didn't have the same organizational features that we needed. And so it looked like it would cause the same problems that we were having with Prototype. And then we looked at YUI. And YUI's approach was very different. YUI was architectural in nature. It was very customizable in that it didn't require to use a certain UI or a certain markup for your code. In addition, it was also extensible, and we could add our own modules however we saw fit. And there's kind of another way to say this, I think, and that is that attribute is awesome, widget is awesome, data source is awesome, and the app framework, which is pretty new, is also pretty awesome. So the homepage of 2010 was the first site that we released with YUI. We basically started from scratch. There were a couple things that had to be ported that were directly from the Prototype code, but for the most part, everything was brand new. Here's a screenshot of that. And so this, to me, is the perfect starter project for YUI because everything in this group is a widget. It's self-contained code, and each one of these modules that we have on here could be defined as their own module. And our content management system in the backend allowed our editors to determine where or if certain modules will load in. Most of the carousels on this page, which is what a lot of these things were, used widget parent and widget child. And we wrote our own version of TabView because TabView had just come out. It was still in beta. But as we extended the page even more and added more modules, we used TabView a lot. We also built a custom plugin for pagination, which was just a node plugin that allowed you to specify your pages, and whenever you would change the page, it would rewrite that node. It's really simple. And we wrote a custom extension called widget fold, which allowed us to delay the rendering of each widget until the user scrolled down the page. So this way we wouldn't have really expensive things like this module down here that has big images and sometimes had flash. They weren't necessarily being loaded until the user actually got down the page. And also another great benefit of this was that our CSS was self-contained for each module. So it was easier to organize because of the way that widget namespace the code. And updates, they were newer, or updates and new features were easier than ever before. And this was great. We could add to the homepage, and maybe they were a little bit too easy because within the first week of launching, we had to release a new module to the page, and these event modules were getting more complex over time. And by the time the first NFL draft came, we already had 4 different states to our event modules with live data loading, animation, and all of these were configured in real time. And only the code that our editors determined needed to be there ended up on the page at once. We didn't have to load in everything, and that was really great. But what story would be complete without conflict, right? And as we went from the homepage and started to integrate YUI across the rest of the site, we found that there was a little bit of trouble that we ran into. So if you're not familiar with Prototype, Prototype does a thing where it extends the prototype of native objects to add polyfills. And so sometimes those polyfills aren't exactly the same as what YUI expects. So in this example that I've added up here, prototype adds a non-standard array sugar called reduce that lets you pluck the first object from a single object array. But reduce is also defined in later versions of JavaScript to do something completely different. And so if YUI's code internally used reduce, or if we tried to use it in our own code, we would have some really strange things happening. But this was actually fairly easy to solve. We created a module that we called prototype compat, and we just had a simple switch that says if the prototype, or if the number of arguments to the function is empty, then use the default prototype function. Otherwise, use YUI's method of reduce. And so this allowed us to keep compatibility with our old code while still taking advantage of the YUI features and not having to plug in too many hacks around the site. But there were some other places we ran into problems like this. We ran into the problem with node.1, in that whenever we tried to call the one method of a node instance, something about prototype would make it throw an exception. And so we thought we were pretty clever and say, just use the prototype method of traversing the DOM and then wrap it in a y.1 container. But this didn't end up working. And for certain selectors, and we found this when implementing tab view, that the prototype selector engine is a little different than YUI selector engine as well. And so we had to figure out a new solution. And this is the one that we're using right now, where we're actually grabbing the ID and searching down from the ID. But there's probably a better solution even than this one. And we found a few conflicts. And most of them had to do with traversing the DOM, strangely with query string parse. And there might even be more conflicts that we haven't even found yet, because some of them are really tough to notice and only happen when you trigger some very strange use cases. So we're still looking for them. But it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all terrible. We found that it was actually really easy to integrate Prototype's custom event module into YUI's. So Prototype has this method called document.fire, which fires a custom event. It allows an object memo to be sent with it. And we were able to use YUI's custom event custom module to override that default fire mechanism, and where the comment is we have some code to actually publish and fire a YUI event at the same time. So doing this allowed our new YUI widgets to use the same custom events that our old prototype widgets were using, and not have to worry about compatibility between the two. And similarly with Flash, YUI's Swift module made it really easy to integrate here as well. We could call custom events straight out of Flash from JavaScript, and without any compatibility problems, as long as there's a colon in the event type. So the HTML score strip is a pretty essential part of the NFL.com's navigation. It sits at the top of almost every single page, and updates to show the scores of the games, as well as certain events that are happening, such as the clock time, and if there's an interception or touchdown, they flash on the score strip as well. And this has looked a little bit different ever since the launch of the site, but it's always been done in Flash. And this drove me crazy, because as primarily a JavaScript developer, I felt that it really needed to be outside of Flash. It needed to have the native browser features, being able to right-click on it and open it in a new tab, and to integrate with our analytics properly. And so it was really a bummer that we had this Flash, this Swift sitting on the top of the pages. But then this thing came out. And as you can see by the big white gaps on the page, it doesn't support Flash. And the score strip is a big part of our website, as I said, and so it just wasn't acceptable for these big gaps that happen with this primary part of the navigation. So thanks to the iPad, we finally got to refactor the score strip into using Flash. And this was pretty cool. We used the widget class for the module. Widget parent is the score strip, and each individual tile is a widget child instance. And this made updating from our data source really easily. The data source came to us via the data source module, and data source XML schema let us parse the XML that Flash was already using really easily and create it into a data object that was easy to manage. And then part of the thing with Flash is that it has this feature called cross-domain XML, which means that a Swift sitting on one site can communicate with another site without having any trouble. And HTML, of course, doesn't have that capability if you're using AJAX. And so we luckily got to use loader and its conditional loading function to get around that. So our score strip can sit on blogs.nfl.com, for example, and make AJAX requests back. And this is how we did that, is that it's a really simple condition on the loader module that if you're not on NFL.com when the score strip is loaded, it loads the iStream version instead. And the iframe version just wraps an iframe that, of our site. And this worked really well for what we needed to do with it. In addition, there were some other benefits too that we didn't anticipate when we refactored it. And the first one is that it became much easier to test our score strip. And so I built this page because there's a lot of conditional logic in football. There's a lot of things that happen throughout the game, and we needed to be able to verify that the visual state of the score strip was correct, even as the state changed throughout time. So this form allowed our QA engineers to create any data scenario that they wanted and be able to test that as those scenarios changed, the display was updating correctly. And and the way that this works is through the power of the atchers and their mutation events. So in this example that I've shown up here, what we're doing is we've created an attribute for isRedZone, and when that property changes, it fires an event that lets us update the view. And this is something that Flash has had for a very long time, and I was really happy to see an easy way to do this in JavaScript, because it made testing so much easier. And the last thing that we didn't expect was that all of a sudden the data events from the score strip became easy to broadcast to the rest of the site. And so we were able to create, and unfortunately my slides don't fit, but with this tiny line of code, adding a broadcast equals to an event, to an event publish statement, all of a sudden those events are available to the whole site. And that let us build things like this, where the score from the game is updated live using the data from the score strip without having to create a second AJAX request and poll and just create more overhead for the browser. And so this allowed us to do more stuff faster because we could just plug into data that was already on the page. And then the last thing that I want to show you guys that we did that was pretty cool is the Pro Bowl ballot. This has been a huge traffic driver for us throughout the last few years. And traditionally, it's also been a form that's done in Flash. And like all forms in Flash, they drive us crazy because we want to do them in HTML. And this year, we released an HTML version of the Pro Bowl ballot built using YUI. And so what you're seeing here is this form has hundreds of players that are in it, and users can select which players that they'd like to see attend the Pro Bowl. And this was built using YUI 3.3. It uses widget parent and widget child to manage the selection of the different states of the Pro Bowl ballot. And the cool thing about this was actually 3 developers divided the work. And like I said before, this had always been a problem for us, but using YUI, we were able to simply define our event interfaces to each other and then broadcast those events back and forth without having to worry too much about conflicts and stepping on each other's toes. And this was great. But then we also had to put it on other sites. But luckily, the YUI's data source is flexible enough that although this was using AJAX to hit data sources, we could also dynamically switch that out with a JSON-P data source, and that was and that allowed us to not have to worry about the details of the transport and simply switch it up when we needed to hit a server that wasn't our own. And that's what these were hosted on domains outside of NFL.com. They had different configuration attributes, and they were pretty easy. We also built a mobile version. And this was kind of cool because it was the first mobile application that we'd built for NFL.com. And since we were starting from scratch, it was pretty easy to upgrade to YUI 3.4. But at the same time, I talked about sharing code. This module shared the exact same data with the same application that was working on the desktop. So the only code that was different was that which was directly related to the UI. And that code used the model and view infrastructure instead. I wanted to try out and see how that worked. And it was pretty cool. So YUI has given us a lot. So it taught us how to talk about architecture. This is something that we always wanted to do, but as front engineers, we never really had a chance. Remember, prototypes kind of told us, hey, it's up to you. YUI gave us a much better structure for our developers to talk to each other. If one developer has to work on another developer's code, he could simply look up the different he knew where to look and start when dealing with things like widget. In this example above, you've got each step of the life cycle, initializer, the render step where you're actually rendering the DOM, where you set your event listeners, and then where you set your state based on the current data, and as well as defining what exactly to do with mutation events. And then what's cut off here is the properties that are scraped directly from the HTML to enable progressive enhancement. And then similarly with CSS, we had a new way to organize ourselves, which was a lot easier. Widget gives you a standard prefix to all of your class names, and you can generate those dynamically. And that really let us figure out exactly where our code needed to be. And this was not just for the content, but also for states. The hidden class was great because if you're using things like CSS transitions, you don't even need to write any JavaScript code. As the hidden property, or as the visible property of widget changes, we can just toggle those CSS transitions right away and not have to worry about writing any script. Same thing with accessibility features like focused, and even DOM nodes within your structure. We could write classes to target without having to worry too much about how to name them or with stepping on the toes of other widgets. So in the end, we were writing applications and not scripts, and this was the great benefit to us. Is all of a sudden we had things like state that we could manage. So it let us abstract the UI from the actual application, and this is an example of that. In our bind UI function here, we're setting two event listeners, one for the actual click event and one for the state changing of open. And of course, the click just sets whether the open state property, but the open change event actually changes the UI. And what this does is it gives us a way to abstract the difference, and if we have a requirements change or a sudden sponsorship comes in and we have to change how the application works, we can do that easily without interrupting too much the rest of the code. We also learned how to combine assets. So this was something that we always wanted to do and didn't really have a path to do it. Luckily for us, developing YUI, you kind of need to use a combination. But the NFL sees so much traffic on a Sunday that we were a little bit leery of allowing or of relying on a different CDN. If something goes wrong with the CDN or they shut us off because we're hitting them too hard, our whole site would go down. And so in order to implement YUI, the NFL had to implement combination ourselves. And this was actually pretty easy once we got PHP installed. We used Minify, and then just a simple configuration in our code allowed us to hit NFL.com instead of YUI CDN for all of our code. And this also showed us, this also allowed us to not combine our own code because we weren't ready to do that as soon as we pulled the trigger on YUI. We didn't want to have to figure out combination of our own code before we rolled YUI out. And so today we've defined as a group over 88 custom modules. These range from audio players to custom share widgets that interact with our third parties, and all kinds of new things, and more are being written every day. But there's still a few things that we've got to figure out. We're not all the way there yet. So, and this might be a function of loader that we just haven't figured out yet, but if you have a module dependency that actually requires a different module in order to do the test, we haven't figured out how to get that right. So in this example, we have our video players that we want to determine whether to use our Swift-based video player or our HTML-based video player. But in order to figure that out, we have to figure out if the user actually has Flash, and the Swift detect module is not included in YUI base. So we have to figure out how to get that detect first. Right now, we're just loading both, which is a bit of a bummer. In addition, image paths and combination are things that we're still trying to figure out. So in this example here, we've got a skin for our audio player, and it exists fairly deep in the folder structure. But once that CSS file is combined, your relative image paths change away from that skin file. And so we've got to figure out how to get this right, because a lot of our skinned assets require images. And there's a few other things that we have to figure out as well. So we work with a lot of third-party vendors and third-party scripts, and YUI 3.4 changed the way that loader works such that every request to, for example, a Facebook.js in different modules would load that script again, and that caused problems on our site. We also use a lot of web fonts. We have about 8 faces that our designers choose between, and loading 8 font faces is really a huge problem because it's almost 200K worth of font files. And so we need to find a way to be able to define fonts on the page with modules and not request them over and over again in multiple CSS files, because the browser will load the font multiple times if that happens. We also want to minify our code. This isn't something that we're able to do quite yet, but it's something that YUI has encouraged us to look into. And then we also want to fit automated testing into our workflow. We don't test our code. We have a great set of QA engineers that hand test all of our code, but it'd be great if we could use Test Runner to automate some of that process to take some of the work off of them. But I do want to give a big thank you to the YUI team. They've done an amazing job with YUI, and it's led to a whole new era of innovation and focus on performance and good engineering at the NFL that really wouldn't be possible without them. And so with that, I want to thank all of you for listening. If you're interested, the slides are going to be up on my website, and you can check me out at these locations. And feel free to ask any questions if you have them.
Do you still use prototype and YUI together?
Yeah, we still, so the question was, do we still use prototype and YUI together? And the answer is yes. We haven't gotten a chance to refactor prototype out of all of our site. Our news articles are still have some prototype components on them, for example, and our whole community section is based on prototype. This summer we released a new version of our game center that is all YUI based, and that was a big win for us. But it's slow. But 100% of our new development is done in YUI, and so I expect the prototype code to slowly be refactored out as we go.
But similarly, do you still have jQuery in your pages or not much?
So the question is, do we have jQuery in our pages? So on NFL.com, we don't use jQuery. Like I said, for our club sites, they use jQuery. But right now, we don't use jQuery at all. Question?
So is widget fold in the gallery?
The question is widget fold in the gallery? It is not. And after Dave's presentation this morning, I'm feeling quite guilty about that. But yeah, we work in Subversion, and we're a little bit new to Git, and haven't quite gotten to the place where we can comfortable getting that into the gallery yet. But we'd like to.
Put it in a paste bin, and I'll do it.
Yeah.
So
question.
I'm just curious, what's preventing you from being able to minify your code?
The question is, what's preventing us from minifying our code? It's more to do with organizational problems than technology ones. Okay. So it has to do with at what point in our build process we're doing it, and also there's some complexities around caching and updating those files. We get a lot of requests to update the functionality of something in between build cycles, and that can be kind of hard when we're minifying. Any other questions? Sir?
Do you have to fight any political issues in the corporation for the adoption of YUI?
So the question is, did we have to fight any political issues? Not really. So our team is pretty small. I said we started out with 4 developers, and we've grown to a huge 7 front-end developers now. And so really we didn't have to fight very many battles. The main battles came around budgeting the time for us to work on this. As you saw from our schedule, we don't have a ton of R&D time built into our build cycles, but we made the case that the benefit to the business of having better performance and making it easier to update our code was worth it, and we think it was.
And you show us a mobile, an iPhone application. Is that a pure web application or is embedded?
So yeah, so is the application. I showed 2 mobile applications. The first one that I showed at the very beginning of the presentation, that is a wrapper around our mobile fantasy product. So there's a very thin iOS shell around what is essentially a web application, and I believe that's powered by YUI, although I'm not positive on that one because it's built by another team. The second thing that I showed that was mobile was our mobile Pro Bowl ballot, and that is a full-fledged web application. It's just pointing a browser at a URL, and that's what we built using YUI 3.4. All right. Oh, you have another question?
What was the first version of YUI you guys used?
The first version of YUI that we used was 3.1.0, and we've been steadily upgrading as they have released new versions. 3.4 was the first one that had a little bit of difficulty upgrading, but I believe we'll be using 3.4 with our next release.
You said with your mobile version, you tried out a model view split.
Yes.
Plugins. Could you just talk a little bit more about
Sure. So he asked me to talk about using the model view split for the mobile version of the Pro Bowl ballot. What we used was the app framework, the MVC framework that was released with YUI 3.4. And what that allowed was, in the same way that I showed widget differentiating the state from the UI, model and view were really great at increasing that abstraction even more. So in the probable ballot, and I can shoot back to that because it's a little bit complicated. So at the bottom of this page are additional navigation controls, like you see offense, defense, and special teams. And so we needed to be able to change the state of the application in the same way while still tracking different elements for metrics. And this was a great way to abstract that the UI difference of here's a click and here's an analytics call from, oh, here's a different state to the application. And that's one of the things that Model and View really helped with. Also, it was a lot easier to sync with the data behind the scenes. We didn't use the controller part of YUI, but Model comes with this sync method that it uses for saving and loading data. And having that in one place was actually really a nice way to do that.
What are the challenges you faced when you upgraded to the 3.4?
What are the challenges we faced in upgrading to 3.4? Most of them had to do with loading in third-party JavaScript components. So we found that they were being loaded in, we were using we were setting a full path and just defining them as a YUI module. But we found that if we had 20 share bars on a page, then it would request those files multiple times from the third party. And the solution that we're working on right now involves defining those modules and using a custom event when they're and then getting them with y.get and then throwing a separate custom event when it's when the module's actually loaded. But we haven't quite gotten all the bugs worked out of that yet.
So how did using this affect how the back end was used, the role of the back end?
So gentleman asked, how did using this, do you mean YUI?
YUI,
Yeah, how did using YUI affect the role that the backend played in our system? So the great thing about starting with YUI is that we didn't really have to change anything from our backend. For the score strip implementation, we used the exact same XML files, and they were highly compressed over the wire with single character values for all of the XML attributes. And we were able to parse that with data schema into a little bit more readable data format that was easier to work with. And so that was actually really nice. And similarly, when we needed to implement the probable ballot and we were posting things back and forth, we used the exact same data source that had been powering the prototype versions. And we customized them a little bit because we had the extra time and we wanted to build the JSONP source as well, but everything worked out of the box just fine. As far as, I mean, are you asking too about, like, do they play less of a role in?
Then was it, well, you answered my question very well.
Okay.
I am also curious about, you know, did that cause the back end to then be strictly for data?
So the follow-up was whether the backend is now strictly for data, and that's not true. We'll also use them for progressive enhancement as well. So we recently did a photo essays project where you can, where editors can define a group of photos and write captions for each one of them, and those are actually progressively rendered on the page. In that the markup is stripped from the HTML, and or the markup is pulled from the HTML and then modified to work within a nicer UI.
Question kind of related to the 3.4 problems with the multiple externals. Do you have one sandbox at the bottom of the page, or do you have like potentially 20 different sandboxes in like YUI parent and .use?
Sure. So the question was, do we use one YUI sandbox or do we use multiple? When we first moved to YUI, we asked for advice from our fantasy developers who were very familiar with it, and that was their advice to us, was to always stick with one sandbox for the whole page. Just do your best to try and to keep that one sandbox. And for the most part, we've done that. We wrote a slight wrapper around Y.use that stores a Y instance locally and puts it on the window and lets you call the same use function multiple times throughout the page. And that works. We haven't really seen any problems with that. It's practically essential when you're working with prototype, because we need to make sure that our prototype compatibility module is loaded in there. But other than that, I don't know that it's strictly necessary. Having multiple YUI sandboxes has never caused any bugs that I can think of. Sure.
Do you have a bunch of adapters that you write for the prototype in your YUI code? So something like class.v8 or hash that's currently in the prototype. You want to reuse this kind of classes in the YUI?
So do we have we created adapters for prototypes classes? And the answer to that is largely no. I mean, other than hash, which you mentioned, YUI does pretty much everything that prototype does, and a lot of the times it does it in an easier way to keep organized. Yeah, so could we have written the adapters to migrate to YUI faster? If we had done that, it might have let us get the prototype library off the page, but then we would have had probably the same volume of code in adapters, and it wouldn't have made the code any easier to manage. So we're not getting rid of prototype because we don't like it. It's more because YUI is easier to manage and lets us create more complicated applications more easily. And so it's more likely that we'll probably just remove the prototype code out of the page as we create new functionality to override the old ones. Great, any other questions? All right, thank you very much.